On December 8, 2005, Moises Garcia was leaving a restaurant in Laredo, Texas, with his pregnant wife beside him and his child in the back seat. His white Lexus had barely moved when a teenage boy walked up to the driver's side, raised a pistol, and started firing through the window. Garcia was hit repeatedly. His wife was struck by bullets passing through his body. The shooter did not shout, panic, or hang around. He moved back to the waiting vehicle, leaving behind a family shattered in seconds and a case that would expose something much bigger than one murder. That was Rosalio, Bart, Reta on a random afternoon, but to understand how he got there, you have to start with the city that raised him. Laredo in the late 1990s and early 2000s was one of the busiest land ports in the United States, with thousands of trucks crossing daily through the World Trade Bridge carrying goods tied to NAFTA-driven commerce. That constant flow of legitimate trade created cover for another stream moving quietly alongside it, where narcotics, weapons, and cash passed through using the same routes that handled everyday shipments. People living in neighborhoods like Los Presidentes did not need official reports to understand what was happening, since they saw luxury vehicles, expensive clothing, and fast money tied to people who never held regular jobs. Younger kids paid attention to that lifestyle early, not through lectures or warnings, but through what they witnessed on the streets and in nearby clubs across the river. Nuevo Laredo, just minutes away, offered a different pace at night, where music, alcohol, and cartel presence blended into a scene that made illegal success look normal, which quietly shaped how ambition formed in that environment. Rosalio, Bart, Reta grew up inside that setting as one of many children in a large Mexican-American household, where his parents worked steady jobs but still struggled to stretch income across a family of 10. His mother worked as a hairstylist while his father handled construction-related work. Nothing about his early life stood out as extreme or unstable, because neighbors later described the family as tight-knit, even while resources remained limited. Friends gave him the nickname Bart due to his spiky hair and facial structure, comparing him to the cartoon character Bart Simpson, which added a casual identity that followed him through school, since teachers and neighbors never described him as someone destined for organized violence, even though small warning signs started to show over time. Those early signs began with minor offenses that felt common in that area, including stealing bicycles and occasionally taking cars for short rides with his friend Gabriel Cardona. Cardona was slightly older, which gave him a bit more confidence in navigating situations that younger kids might hesitate to enter, so their friendship quickly became a partnership built on risk. What started as small acts of theft slowly shifted towards smuggling, where they moved stolen vehicles or small drug quantities across the border for quick cash. Crossing between Laredo and Nuevo Laredo remained easy for them since they carried U.S. birth certificates, which allowed movement without raising immediate suspicion at checkpoints. That freedom reinforced a pattern where boundaries felt flexible, making it easier for them to operate in two different systems without fully belonging to either one. As their activities expanded, the influence of their peer circle became more visible, as friends and acquaintances who already had connections to organized groups began pulling them deeper into that lifestyle. Cardona often pushed decisions forward, relying on his slightly older status and existing contacts, which meant Reta followed a path shaped partly by trust in that relationship. Adults around them noticed changes, including late nights, unexplained money, and increasing time spent across the border, yet intervention rarely went beyond warnings that did not alter behavior. That lack of strong interruption allowed their involvement to grow without immediate consequences, creating space for more serious opportunities to appear. By the time they reached their early teens, they were already spending time in places that exposed them to people operating at a higher level than simple street crime. Nightclubs in Nuevo Laredo, especially spots like Eclipse, became central to that exposure, since those locations attracted individuals connected to cartel operations who openly displayed wealth and influence. For teenagers like Reta and Cardona, those environments offered a direct look at what power looked like in their world, not through stories, but through real interactions with people who controlled movement, money, and territory. Expensive vehicles parked outside, combined with the presence of women, music, and cash, created an atmosphere that felt aspirational rather than dangerous. The attraction extended beyond money because identity played a role where being recognized, respected, and feared carried its own appeal. That visibility did not go unnoticed by those already inside the system, as recruiters actively watched for young individuals who could move easily between both sides of the border. Approaches from cartel operatives did not happen in one dramatic moment, but rather through repeated contact that built familiarity and trust over time. Offers were framed in practical terms, including a weekly payment of around $500 just to remain available, along with bonuses that could reach tens of thousands for completing assignments. Those numbers held serious weight for teenagers who had never seen that kind of money, especially when paired with promises of cars, housing, and access to drugs and nightlife. The structure made entry feel less like a forced decision and more like stepping into a system already operating around them, where expectations were clear and rewards came quickly. At the center of that recruitment process stood Miguel Z40 Trevino Morales, a rising figure within Los Zetas, known for building a network that relied on both discipline and intimidation. Trevino's interest in young recruits came from strategic thinking rather than impulse, since American teenagers brought advantages that traditional cartel members could not match. Their citizenship allowed them to cross checkpoints with less scrutiny, while their language skills helped them blend into different environments without drawing attention. Once Reta and Cardona entered that circle, they moved from casual interactions into structured roles where expectations shifted from small tasks to something much more serious. The transition happened quickly because they were taken to a ranch used for training, where new recruits were prepared for assignments that required precision and loyalty. That move marked a clear break from their previous life, as daily routines changed from school and minor crime to something that operated under a completely different set of rules. Once Rosalio Reta arrived at the ranch sometime around 2004, the environment shifted from street hustle into something structured, where former Mexican Special Forces soldiers connected to Los Zetas ran daily operations with discipline that resembled military training. Recruits woke early, followed strict schedules, and rotated through instruction that covered weapons handling, surveillance methods, and coordinated movement across different terrains. AK-47 rifles, pistols, grenades, and tactical positioning were introduced step by step, with instructors correcting mistakes immediately, sometimes through physical punishment rather than verbal guidance. Over time, exposure to violent scenarios stopped feeling like an exception, as trainees were pushed to treat it as routine, which slowly reshaped how they responded to danger and authority. As those sessions continued, instructors placed emphasis on fear as a controlling tool, where obedience mattered more than understanding, so recruits learned to follow instructions without questioning intent or outcome. Stories circulated within the camp about consequences for disobedience, including beatings and forced demonstrations that showed what happened to anyone who broke rank. That atmosphere created a constant pressure that stayed present even during rest periods, making it clear that there was no safe moment where someone could detach from the role assigned to them. Recruits began to measure themselves through performance rather than identity, focusing on how well they executed tasks rather than who they were before arriving. That shift set the foundation for a deeper transformation, where personal history started to lose relevance compared to the expectations placed on them inside that system. The indoctrination process did not rely on one event, since it developed through repetition that removed hesitation little by little, replacing instinctive reactions with trained responses tied directly to orders. Group identity became stronger with each shared task, as recruits relied on each other for survival within the structure created by instructors, which made individual thinking less important over time. Symbols connected to Santa Muerte started appearing more frequently, with some recruits adopting tattoos or carrying images that represented protection and loyalty to the organization. Those rituals did not feel separate from training, as they reinforced the idea that survival depended on commitment to the group and acceptance of its rules. Rewards came through money, access to drugs, or small privileges, while punishment stayed immediate and visible, creating a cycle where behavior aligned closely with expectations set by those in control. Accounts of Rita's first kill vary depending on who tells the story, which leaves gaps that investigators and journalists have tried to piece together over the years. One version suggests that Miguel Z40 Trevino Morales himself handed him a weapon during an initiation exercise, pointing toward a restrained man and making it clear that refusal would not be tolerated. Other reports describe similar scenarios without confirming who was present, focusing instead on the structure of these tests, where recruits proved loyalty through action rather than words. Reta later spoke about that moment in interviews, explaining that he understood the situation fully and made a decision that marked a permanent shift in his life. While details remain uncertain, what stays consistent across accounts is the outcome, which shows that he crossed the line at a very young age under conditions designed to remove alternatives. Following that moment, internal changes became more visible through how Reta described his actions in later interviews, where he framed killing as a task rather than something tied to emotion or moral judgment. He spoke about it using language that compared it to work, explaining that assignments came with instructions, payment, and expectations that needed to be met without delay. That mindset reflected a shift where emotional responses were replaced by efficiency, allowing him to move from one assignment to another without pausing to reflect on consequences. Over time, detachment became part of his routine, supported by the environment he operated in and the people around him who reinforced similar behavior. Violence no longer stood out as something unusual, since it blended into daily activities that included training, planning, and waiting for the next instruction. Once training reached a point where recruits were considered ready, Reta transitioned back toward operational work tied to the United States side of the border, where his citizenship provided a strategic advantage for Los Zetas. He was assigned to a small cell that included Gabriel Cardona and Jesse Gonzalez, forming a group that handled specific targets connected to rival organizations. Safe houses in Laredo became their base, where they stored weapons, communicated with handlers, and prepared for assignments using information passed down from higher levels. Communication relied on prepaid cell phones, often replaced after each assignment to reduce traceability, which allowed them to operate without maintaining long-term contact records. Daily life within that structure blended elements of normal teenage behavior with responsibilities tied to organized violence, creating a routine that shifted between ordinary activities and planned attacks. Inside safe houses, they spent time playing video games, watching television, and socializing in ways that matched their age, which created a sense of normalcy that contrasted sharply with their assignments. When instructions arrived, the shift from casual behavior to focused action happened quickly, as they moved from preparation to execution without extended discussion. Payment reinforced that cycle, since each assignment brought financial rewards that allowed them to purchase clothes, drugs, and access to nightlife across the border. That combination of routine and reward made the lifestyle feel sustainable in the short term. Access to money and status changed how Reta and his associates moved through their environment as they began to adopt patterns that reflected their position within the organization. Vehicles like a Mercedes-Benz, reportedly valued around $70,000, became part of their daily experience, even though they were still teenagers without legal driving age in some cases. Clothing, jewelry, and spending habits reflected a shift from scarcity to excess. That lifestyle also brought exposure to drugs and relationships that further tied them to the system, making separation more difficult over time. While those rewards appear to offer control and independence, they also deepened the reliance on the structure that provided them. As assignments continued, frequency increased and targets expanded, pushing the group further into active conflict linked to cartel operations in Laredo during 2005 and early 2006. Surveillance became more detailed, with Reta and his associates tracking movements of individuals connected to rival groups such as the Sinaloa Cartel, documenting routines and identifying moments of vulnerability. Confidence grew with each completed assignment, leading to decisions that carried higher risks, including operating in areas with greater visibility or increased law enforcement presence. That shift did not happen suddenly, since it developed through repeated success that made detection feel less likely and consequences seem distant. By the time that confidence reached its peak, the group had already entered a phase where their actions were tied directly to a broader conflict, setting the stage for the violence that followed across both sides of the border. By 2005, the conflict between the Gulf Cartel and the Sinaloa Cartel had turned Laredo into a contested zone, since control of the Interstate 35 corridor meant control over billions in narcotics distribution moving into the United States. Miguel Z40 Trevino Morales pushed Los Zetas to secure that gateway, using violence to remove anyone linked to Sinaloa operations, which placed local dealers, transporters, and associates directly in the crosshairs. That strategy relied on mobility and discretion, so American teenagers like Rosalio, Reta, and Gabriel Cardona became valuable assets due to their ability to cross checkpoints without drawing immediate suspicion. Their citizenship allowed them to operate inside Texas while maintaining connections across the border, creating a hybrid role that traditional cartel members could not easily replicate. Once that advantage became clear, their assignments shifted from minor tasks into targeted killings tied directly to the broader cartel war. Since targets were identified through information passed down from higher-ranking members connected to Trevino's network, Reta and his team received names, photographs, and sometimes detailed background information that outlined daily routines, including work schedules, family habits, and common routes. Surveillance became a central part of their work, where they spent days following individuals through neighborhoods in Laredo, noting patterns that could reveal moments of vulnerability. Once a routine became predictable, they selected locations where escape routes were manageable, often near intersections or parking areas that allowed quick departure. Execution relied on speed and precision, with shooters approaching the vehicle or individual directly, firing multiple rounds and retreating before bystanders could react. Escape involved switching vehicles within blocks of the scene, moving to prearranged safe houses where weapons and clothing could be discarded or replaced. One of the most documented killings tied to Reta occurred on December 8, 2005. A local drug dealer connected to Sinaloa distribution became a target under orders linked to Trevino's campaign. Garcia had been under observation for days, with Reta and his associates tracking his movements through Laredo, noting his routine of spending time with family and operating within specific neighborhoods. On that afternoon, Garcia was leaving a restaurant with his wife and young child, unaware that he had already been identified and marked for elimination. As his vehicle moved toward the exit, Reta's team positioned their car to block his path, creating a controlled environment where escape became difficult. Reta exited the vehicle and approached the driver's side, firing multiple rounds into Garcia at close range, striking him in the head and upper body while his family remained inside the car. The attack lasted only seconds, yet the impact extended beyond the immediate victim, since Garcia's wife and child witnessed the shooting at close range, leaving lasting psychological effects even though they survived physically. That operation followed the expected pattern of speed and efficiency, but it also introduced a critical mistake, as witnesses later described the shooter's appearance, including a distinctive facial mold that became an identifying detail. Other killings during that period reflected a similar pattern, reinforcing the idea that these were coordinated actions rather than isolated incidents. Bruno Orozco, a former police officer who had shifted allegiance to Sinaloa operations, was tracked, abducted, and executed in a manner that signaled a direct message to rivals. On January 8, 2006, Noe Flores became another victim, although investigators later determined that he had been mistaken for his brother, who was the intended target. That error demonstrated how reliance on visual identification and routine tracking could lead to fatal mistakes when information was incomplete or misinterpreted. Evidence recovered from the Flores scene included a cigarette pack left inside a getaway vehicle, which later provided a key link to Reta through fingerprint analysis. The Resendez ambush on April 2, 2006 further illustrated the escalation as multiple shooters surrounded a vehicle carrying Jesus Maria Chuy Resendez and his nephew Mariano near Zapata Highway, firing numerous rounds that killed both individuals. These events show consistency in method, where surveillance, coordinated positioning, and rapid execution define each operation. Operational patterns remain consistent across these incidents, as Reta and his associates relied on prepaid cell phones to communicate with handlers and each other, replacing devices frequently to avoid long-term tracking. Safe houses across Laredo served as staging points where they stored weapons, rested between assignments, and received new instructions from contacts linked to Trevino's network. Vehicles used in attacks were often abandoned shortly after each operation, with secondary cars arranged for escape, allowing them to distance themselves from the crime scene quickly. Monitoring police radio traffic provided additional awareness, helping them adjust movements when law enforcement activity increased in specific areas. That system created a level of coordination that allowed them to operate repeatedly without immediate capture, reinforcing their confidence and encouraging more frequent assignments. However, as the number of operations increased, mistakes began to accumulate, often tied to overconfidence and the speed at which assignments were carried out. The cigarette pack left in the Flores case became one of the first major breaks for investigators, as fingerprints connected to Reta provided tangible evidence linking him to the scene. Phone records associated with prepaid devices also began to form a network of connections, revealing patterns of communication that investigators could map over time. Witness descriptions, including the physical details noted during the Garcia killing, added another layer of identification that could not be easily dismissed. These errors did not occur in isolation, since each one added to a growing body of evidence that law enforcement agencies started to piece together across multiple cases. What initially appeared as separate incidents gradually formed a pattern that pointed toward a specific group operating within Laredo. Detective Robert Garcia played a central role in recognizing that pattern, as he reviewed homicide reports and noticed similarities in execution style, vehicle usage, and timing of attacks. Working within the Laredo Police Department, he coordinated with federal agencies including the DEA and FBI, sharing information that expanded the scope of the investigation beyond local jurisdiction. Building the case required patience, since evidence came from different sources, including forensic analysis, witness statements, and intelligence gathered through ongoing surveillance. Garcia focused on connecting those fragments into a coherent narrative that could withstand scrutiny in court, understanding that a single mistake in interpretation could weaken the entire case. As the investigation progressed, the stakes increased for both sides, especially after direct contact between Reta and Garcia introduced a personal dimension to the pursuit. At some point during the investigation, Reta obtained Garcia's contact information and placed a call that shifted the tone of the case as he issued a warning telling the detective to stop pursuing the murders or face consequences. That action demonstrated a mix of confidence and immaturity, since reaching out directly to law enforcement increased his visibility rather than reducing it. Garcia interpreted the threat as confirmation that the investigation was moving in the right direction, reinforcing his determination to continue despite the risks involved. The call also highlighted how deeply Reta had become involved in the system, as he spoke with the assurance of someone who believed he understood the environment he operated within. Instead of slowing the investigation, that moment intensified efforts to identify and apprehend those responsible for the killings. Wiretaps and informants provided additional insight into the network as federal agencies intercepted conversations that revealed details about operations, including references to past killings and discussions about future targets. Some of those recordings included statements from individuals connected to Reta's group, offering indirect confirmation of events that had already been linked through physical evidence. Informants within the network contributed further information, often in exchange for reduced charges or protection, helping investigators understand how the group functioned on a daily basis. These sources did not always provide complete clarity, since motivations varied and reliability could differ, but when combined with other evidence, they strengthened the overall case. Gradually, the structure that had allowed the group to operate began to weaken as more information became available to law enforcement. The turning point came with the arrest of Gabriel Cardona in early 2006, following a series of investigative steps that linked him to multiple incidents connected to the same network. Facing significant charges, Cardona chose to cooperate, providing information that filled gaps in the investigation and placed additional pressure on Reta. That cooperation disrupted the operational structure as the flow of information between members became uncertain and trust within the group began to erode. Jesse Gonzalez fled to Mexico, attempting to avoid arrest, while Reta remained active for a short period before circumstances forced him to reconsider his position. With one member in custody and another on the run, the stability that had supported their operations collapsed, where law enforcement moved to close in on the remaining individuals involved. By early 2006, Rosalio Reta started losing control of the structure that once protected him, especially after an unauthorized nightclub attack in Monterrey, where grenades were thrown into a crowded venue, killing 4 people and injuring more than 20. That move crossed lines set by Miguel Zavardi Trevino Morales, who expected discipline from his crews, so punishment came quickly through beatings and humiliation meant to remind him he was replaceable. What once made him valuable started working against him, since unpredictability made him a liability rather than an asset, which created tension inside the same system that built him. As paranoia increased, he began moving more carefully, aware that threats were no longer coming only from law enforcement, but also from within his own organization. That shift forced him to consider escape, especially after hearing that other operatives who lost favor had been eliminated, so he attempted to move away from direct assignments and distance himself from active operations. Mexican authorities eventually captured him in 2006 after tracking movement tied to ongoing investigations, placing him in custody where survival depended on the next decision he made. Instead of staying silent, he reached out to U.S., Authorities, including Detective Robert Garcia, understanding that cooperation offered protection from retaliation that Mexican custody could not guarantee. That decision marked a transition where he moved from active participant to a witness, providing information that connected cases across Laredo and beyond. During trials in Texas between 2007 and 2009, prosecutors presented evidence including fingerprints, phone records, and testimony linking him to the murders of Moises Garcia and Noe Flores, which resulted in sentences totaling around 70 years. Those convictions covered only a fraction of the killings he admitted to, since many occurred in Mexico outside U.S. jurisdiction, leaving gaps between what was proven and what was alleged. Inside prison, his statements shifted over time, sometimes describing pride in his actions, while at other moments acknowledging regret, which reflected a struggle between identity and consequence. His testimony helped authorities understand how cartels recruited American teenagers, leading to tighter enforcement and increased awareness along the border. For families of victims like Moises Garcia and Noe Flores, the outcome brought limited closure because sentences could not undo the impact of those losses, even as violence in Laredo declined after key arrests disrupted operations. The case exposed how young recruits were used within larger systems that valued access and mobility over experience, prompting changes in how agencies approached cross-border investigations. Looking back to that interview room in 2006, the image of a teenager facing consequences meant for hardened criminals still stands out, since it reflects how environment, opportunity, and failure of intervention combined over time. The system stopped him, but the conditions that created him still exist,